Hi. Sorry, dropping papers. So it is Tuesday morning, and I just finished putting in grades in the grade book, and I am super concerned. I have people that haven't turned in a single assignment. I have people that have turned in maybe like one task. You like grades are not great. And so I'm super concerned that you guys have not followed the scope of the assignment. So I am providing this as a last ditch effort to try to make sure you guys are prepared for this test tomorrow. Anyways, I wanted to kind of do a quick run through on some of the aspects of the 1920s. Um, so we talked about, so you got two main presidents in the 1920s, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. The big concept is that Harding talks about return to normalcy. What he's talking about is this idea of kind of removing the progressive controls, right? One of the big ones has to do with his Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who wants to cut the size of government, wants to cut taxes, that people would have more money that they could spend. And if they can spend more money, that's going to stimulate economic growth. So you want to be sure that you understand kind of this idea of what is called supply side economics. He's got Herbert Hoover, who we'll talk about towards the end of the 1920s. He'll become president in 1929. He's not going to focus on regulating businesses. He's going to focus on more about encouraging cooperation. Now, one of the problems with Harding's administration is because there's very little oversight. There's not a lot of, no one's paying attention to what's going on. There's a lot of corruption in his administration. There's a Veterans Bureau scandal. The Attorney General gets in trouble for bribery. The big one that you need to know for the state of Texas is the Teapot Dome scandal, where essentially the Secretary of the Interior accepted bribes to let people drill on the national oil reserves, and he will actually spend a few months in jail. So you want to be familiar with the Teapot Dome scandal, and that it has to do with bribery and oil. Foreign policy wise, the big thing you need to know is isolation. The United States is not particularly interested in what's going on. We want to, we're tired of global involvement. Harding will have a heart attack while he's in office and die, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, will take over. Coolidge is going to be even more big business than Harding, less corrupt, though. So you'll have less corruption. He'll kind of clean up the political environment, but it's going to be very pro-business, very friendly to that. The whole idea is going to be that the government has very little responsibility, to do anything other than just the most basic elements of running the country. And you can see right here this cartoon, trim wherever you can, Calvin Coolidge, and that would be that the teddy bear from Teddy Roosevelt progressive era, kind of gives you an idea kind of how he saw things. Coolidge will win handily in 1924. His foreign policy gets a little more complicated. You have the United States starting to make significant loans to Germany to help them make their loan payments and that sort of thing. So that kind of gives you the political overview. If you look at 1920s industry, we've already talked about this a lot. You have the issue of the automobile, mass production. Again, Henry Ford doesn't invent the assembly line. He doesn't necessarily invent mass production. He just does it really, really well, and he adapts it so that it becomes highly successful. You have increased, between the low taxes and the increased production, people start making more money, which means people can buy things. And so you just have a lot of different aspects of the 1920s coming into play. He mass produces the Model T, very, lower sales cost, but increased volume. So he ends up making more money. He's able to pass it on to his workers. So suddenly everybody has an automobile, right? His workers get paid a lot more. Which is kind of unique, although he does kind of keep an eye on what his workers are doing. And you have lots of other industries that come from the automobile, as well as a series of social changes, right? The role for women, the idea that you have a lot more small businesses, rural life becomes less lonely. lots of consumers, right? Consumer goods, advertising, fashion and beauty devices, disposable products, electric razors. You have airplanes that come in. They, first used in World War I, then they start using them for the post office. Then Charles Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic in 1927. And then by 1928, you have airlines actually letting people travel. Glenn Curtiss creates the airplane engine. So you've got a series, you got the airplane being a big deal. The radio becomes a big deal, growing money. You've got, the 1928 presidential elections covered on the radio. So people are starting to listen to that. Really changes the way society functions. You have a much looser attitude about money. People are much more content to spend that, well, we don't need to save, easy credit terms. We talked about that quite a bit. Hopefully, not everybody on their advertisement kind of task bothered to put in information about installment plans, which was one of the things you were supposed to do. But that's definitely, part of what's going on here with this consumer society. You have a lot more managers, people's working life really begins to change. And I put some ads here from the 1920s to kind of give you an idea. Now, one thing we haven't talked about very much, largely because in the scope and sequence, they've kind of phased this out a little bit. But it's worth mentioning that farmers started to have some economic problems long before it spread to everyone else. So you start having farmers falling out of the economy, largely because they had borrowed a lot of money during World War I and right after to get new technology, to buy more land, and farming prices, agricultural prices drop once Europe recovers. Plus, remember, the U.S. has raised tariffs to protect our manufacturing, so people have to buy American products. And so that has begun to hurt farmers. So sharecroppers are being hurt. Independent farmers are being hurt. And so you're just kind of having this increasing, quiet depression going on, making farmers having less ability to participate. Now, the impact of that is it's going to drive people into the cities. You're going to have increased urbanization, but it's not going to help. But it's kind of your first sign that maybe the economy is not as healthy as everyone thinks it is. Coolidge refuses to kind of help the farmers at all. He refuses to sign off on a bill. And you start to have, lots of credit for Americans. You have a farm recession. You have the banks who are loaning money left and right to stockbrokers who are buying stocks on margin, to people, making consumer credit loans. So you get all this, and then they're making loans to Germany. So you've got banks overextended. You've got the government not regulating anything, not keeping an eye on anything. Americans high in debt. And farmers beginning to hurt as well. And so all of this is going to lead to the 1920s society. And we've talked about the nativism, the fear of kind of immigrants. And remember that the immigrant fear has its roots in the Red Scare, has its roots in the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the concerns. And some of that was happening before World War I, when there was concern about cultural changes and do we want to have this many poor people coming in, and immigrants can tend to be poor and all this kind of stuff. So there's kind of this backlash against immigration, in addition to the fact that people feel like that only native-born Americans should have access to the prosperity of the 1920s. You have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during this period, in part because of immigration, but also because of racism. You need to know that immigration controls, the Immigration Quota Act of 1921, the National Origins Act of 1924, significantly limit immigration from Europe, does not limit immigration from Mexico. So they are still using Mexican workers primarily in agricultural fields. You have women who are voting, who got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Between that and the automobile and their financial independence from working during World War I and working after, gaining more opportunities, they begin to change how they look, right? They go from having long hair to having short hair, to wearing shorter skirts, to showing their legs, that kind of thing. And there's lots of concern. There's a backlash against all this change, this idea of fundamentalism, that you have to have a literal belief in the Bible. You have lots of radio evangelists. And this all culminates in the Scopes trial, which is creationism versus science. It has to do with the teaching of evolution in schools in Tennessee. You also have prohibition, which was one of the last kind of changes of the progressive era. But in the 1920s, you don't have any enforcement of it, and this is going to lead to the rise of organized crime. You have art and literature. You've got The Great Gatsby. F. Scott Fitzgerald is probably the most famous. Lots of it reflects the alienation that people feel in kind of this consumer society and this modern society. And because you have cinema and radio, you have the development of pop culture. Tin Pan Alley starts producing all the sheet music and the records so people can listen to jazz music. The radio brings all these shows into people's homes. So you start to have a nationalized culture in a lot of ways. The sports heroes, right? Motion pictures, all that kind of stuff really changes the way culture functions. In American society. And then lastly, the one thing I want to talk about is African Americans. And we've talked about the Harlem Renaissance, a lot about kind of this cultural flowering, the sense of African American pride. Jazz music and blues is a big part of it. And it's a direct result of the Great Migration, of these African American communities kind of coalescing in the North. These communities do express themselves politically. You have the NAACP kind of starting to get very active, really kind of getting these African American neighborhoods to kind of vote together to push back against certain politicians. And you definitely see the NAACP being much more active. But that's not the only option African Americans have. They have Marcus Garvey, United Negro Improvement Association. This is what he calls Negro nationalism, Black nationalism, which is really about self-reliance, right? Even to the point of moving to Africa. And a lot of African Americans who are in the middle class or who had been working with the NAACP kind of reject this Black nationalism. So you want to know that Marcus Garvey presents a different view than what the NAACP presents. And ultimately, I don't want to go into too much about the causes of the Great Depression, but I do want to mention that you have, you had this idea of isolation, high tariffs, supply side economics. And when Hoover comes in and he's elected in 1928, he promises continued prosperity, right? And most people were willing to put up with prohibition, even though it increased crime and there were starting to be some rumblings against doing away with it. But the issue was that the prosperity is largely built on credit. And that credit had meant that businesses were able to pretend like they were healthier than they were. Stockbrokers were borrowing money to buy stocks. People were borrowing money to buy stocks. Banks were investing in the stock market. And this long period of economic growth, this bull market period, had encouraged this speculation and this buying on margin. Well, what will begin to happen is that by September of 1929, people realize that the economy is not doing that well. And the professional investors start selling off. Well, by October of 1929, ordinary people figure that out and they start to panic. And then they have a massive sell-off. And so that at first, it seems, you have a group of people that lose a lot of money that are pretty upset. But for ordinary Americans that weren't heavily invested, if invested at all in the stock market, they're okay. What's going to affect them is going to be that the banking system had been stretched too thin. It had been, overextended with loans to companies, to stockbrokers, to Germany, to France. And so those banks begin to lose money. And there's not deposit insurance. So when a bank runs out of cash and it closes its doors, if you had $1,000 saved in that bank, you're just out of luck. You can sue, but good luck getting your money. So this is going to be kind of one of the major triggers. So we do kind of attribute the stock market crash of 1929 to the beginning of the Great Depression. But it's not really until about 1930, 1931 that we really start to see the impacts of that. And of course, a lot of it is mismanagement by by the government. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates at the absolute worst time, tightens the money supply even more. You have a series, the farming crisis is happening. You have a series of natural disasters in Mississippi and Florida. And you have an uneven wealth distribution. You got a small group of people with a lot of money and a lot of people with kind of so amounts of money. But the problem is those people with a lot of money who manage to, they sell off their stocks. They're going to do okay. They're still rich, but they will never contribute to the economy in the same way that a large middle class will. And that large middle class, between the stock market, between companies shutting down, between banks closing, they're losing access to money. So we'll be revisiting this when we get to Unit 6, but I thought I'd just kind of give you a preview of kind of what the causes of the Great Depression were. Hopefully this gets you ready for the test tomorrow. I'm going to share this on Edpuzzle so that way I can encourage people to actually watch it.